Hello, everybody, and welcome to our autumn lecture sessions. We're going to start with Kingswood House. And really, this is a resume of where we've got to at the moment, because Kingswood Arts and the Friends of Kingswood House and the Dulwich Society are working together to get, and we have found a whole lot more about it, a whole lot of new research, particularly, as you'll find later, in Canada, which is great. Because in the First World War, as many will know, Kingswood House was a Canadian Army convalescent home. Anyway, let's start back in about 1812, when the first house was built on the site. This is an extract from a lease plan in the Dulwich estate. But you can just see the house a little bit. It was a bit stuck in the middle of the fields. There was not many other things around it. The nearest house would have been in College Road, would have been Woodhall in College Road, and the manor house back in Croxted Road. So the first owner, the man who built the house, or took the first lease and built the house, was William Vizard, a solicitor. He looks quite a jolly chap, dressed in sort of Regency outfits. But his claim to fame was the lease he took, £300 per annum, quite a lot of money in those days. And he covenanted to build the mansion, the coach house, stables, barn, and 2 lodges, none of which unfortunately remain. He had offices in Holborn, but his claim to fame was to defend Queen Caroline, pictured here, or somewhat later life, I think, against the divorce proceedings by George IV in 1820. Later on, as I say, he was Secretary of the Bankruptcy Court and President of the newly formed Lawn Society. But let's just go one further, and here's the House of Lords meeting, or picture of it, in 1820, when because she was being tried in the House of Lords, and he managed to get the bill thrown out by organising opposition to the second reading. And I'm not sure that's him speaking up there, but anyway. But the interesting thing is there's another Dulwich connection with Queen Caroline, and it's this chap here, Octavius Wigram, who lived at Dulwich Lodge. Now, Dulwich Lodge is where the new German school is, in Half Moon Lane. That's where it used to be. And in fact, the building was still there until the 60s. But anyway, Wigram's claim to fame was that he was actually at the door when and he stopped Queen Caroline from, if you like, gate crashing the coronation, George IV's coronation. So interesting that there's 2 Dulwich connections on there. Now, this is also, the research up until now has suggested that Vizard moved out in the early 1830s, and that's sort of true, but you can see here from the left that the house is up for sale first in 1827. You see the college rent has gone up a bit. It's 70 years left on the lease. But it's up even more detail for sale in 1829, so it obviously didn't sell. And this is a much more positive, George Robbins, rather than Winstanley and Sons, gives it a much more positive, upbeat description, more comfort than modern residents can pretend to, seated in a park of 25 acres, and extensive pleasure grounds laid out, as you would expect, in good taste, and a terrace walk, ornamented with a profusion of American and flowering plants, and is terminated by wood, through which are romantic walks. It's more about the garden than actually about the house. We'll see later we get to learn much more about the house and the size of the rooms, and talks about the gates, and then it's, 67 years by now. But in fact, it didn't sell. And in 1831, it was occupied by an actor called Joseph Shepherd Munden. And the reason we know this is a newspaper article dated 1831 saying that he was there. Now, we know from records in the Dulwich Estate Archive that he obviously didn't own the house, So we assume he either rented it or was just living there, as a tenant, a short-term tenant, um, while Vizard moved on elsewhere. And McMundan was quite a well-known actor at the time. As I say, his first London appearance, he was at Covent Garden 90, and he was a celebrated comedian of his day, perhaps a John Cleese version. Who knows? Anyway, he was only there for a very short time because later the same year, we have a new lessee, James Hannon. And you'll see several of these black pictures because we have no picture of him, unfortunately. But we do know he was a merchant. But while he may have been an interesting chap, we know nothing about him. More interesting were his two sons. And this is Sir Nicholas John Hannon, who was a barrister and a well-known diplomat and judge in China and Japan, as you can see here, judge of the British Court for Japan, whatever that was, and Chief Justice of the British Supreme Court, China and Japan. And he was also current Consul General in Shanghai, so a busy chap. But the interesting thing, what we do find in the newspapers is here is the record of his birth at Kingswood Lodge, and that of his brother, his elder brother also. And he had a much older brother, and this is him here, James Hannon, and he was another judge. They were all lawyers, so but you got it here. They were quite, well-known and influential lawyers at the time. But Dad, I'm afraid we know very little about. Now, here is the house up for sale again, and the description is much more interesting from the house point of view. It describes the garden and everything, but here you've got the handsome portico entrance, mahogany doors. It's got 7 bedrooms, principal bedrooms, with convenient closets, dressing rooms, ladies' boudoir, bathroom, and the odd water closet, probably. And you've got water laid on the top floor. That's pretty radical. I mean, the 27 by 17 is not a bad size, but not huge by luxury house standards. And drawing rooms, billiard room. Everybody would have had a billiard room then. They always had convenient domestic offices. And yeah, you can, horses, all the farm bits, the whole thing. And what's interesting though, the lease is now 58 years and the rents come down quite a bit. So obviously the estate, everyone was having trouble getting rid of it, although they could have bought more meadowland if he desired. And that's the interesting thing. All auctions at those times, you had to get a ticket to view. You couldn't just turn up and view. And here is his grave in Norwood Cemetery, and the grave of one of his sons, the columbarian in Walgrave, which I think is in Berkshire. Don't shoot me if I'm wrong. But yeah, a prosperous, successful family. And they sold the lease to William Cooper, who was their main business as wine merchant, but Sharon and I have discovered he also had toes in railway construction, which of course in the 1840s was the business to be in. The only picture I've got is of his mortgagor, Lord Murray, who has provided the mortgage for the purchase of the house, and £10,000. That's quite a lot of money. Here you are, and other messages, buildings and hereditaments situated in Dulwich in the county of Surrey. We know he's there in 1851 because here he is, the census return. He is a wine merchant. It's not that big a household. He's just got his wife and 3 servants. And here is his railway business. He's on the Provisional Management Committee of the Tottenham Farringdon Junction Railway, which did exist, not for long, and the Madrid and Valencia Railway Company, which sounds far more exotic. But of course, in those days, British engineers were building railways everywhere. He sold out in the early 1850s to John Conrad im Thurn, a Swiss-born merchant and banker. The Imtherns are actually quite a well-known family in Dulwich, and he was living in Herne Hill at the time, at Champion Hill. And here's his census. So we know in 1851 he was at Champion Hill. So he buys the house, we think, in 1852. Here's the lease assignment on 12th of April, 1852. But in 1861, he's still at Champion Hill. So did he actually ever move or not? This is just a filler, if you like. This is his naturalization in 1871. So they often, the foreign merchants who lived in Dulwich took a time to be naturalized. It was, you thought they would have done it earlier. But Imthern's, the business went bust. They owed, £3 million in those days. But it seems that the family managed to keep going. So, but anyway, but the reason that Imthern, if he did move in, it was only for a very short period. Oh, sorry, no, let's talk about, these are two of his sons. No, his grandson. His sons, Ferdinand Imthern, very well-known author, photographer and colonial administrator, and one of his grandsons was a vice admiral in the British Navy. So that's so the Swiss and those Swiss family turning to British. And here's the 1852 map. This is what you would have seen. Here is, I think, Kingswood House. They got the odd pool. It's not, I mean, estate maps are not that accurate, but they do give us, this is College Road, or Penge Road, as it would have been then. Here is the entrance. And there's another entrance down here. And this is the entrance which you can still see today on Alleyne Park, next to the Dulwich Prep London School. There's the lodge is still there, not dating from this time, but at a later period, there's a lodge still there. But as you can see, it was all fields, and you would think, yeah, it was nice for him to move into. Until, of course, along comes the London, Chatham and Dover Railway Company. And they proceed to drive a railway line straight through most of his plot. Here is Kingswood House. Here is his former entrance to the Penge Road, which is going to be cut in half by the railway. Here's his other entrance, still there, although it might have been cut. The actual railway that we know today, that was built by the London, Chatham and Railway Company, is this one here. The other red lines are put on by the estate when they were discussing possible other railway routes to go around, particularly to get to Crystal Palace, the Crystal Palace high-level station. This is something to do with that, but the actual line was here. So basically, you can understand that Imthern didn't think living in the house and having a railway built in your front garden was really what he wanted. So he very quickly assigned the land to the railway company, to the London, Chatham and Dover Railway Company. And I think we have to think, I mean, we have no idea really how they built railways and things in those days, but these are some pictures of brick making, not in Sydenham, not in Dulwich, but of brick taking at the same time. And one can imagine the chaos and pollution that would result from baking the bricks. The story is that they cut the bricks, the clay for the bricks was cut out of the tunnel, excuse me, as they bored through. The interesting bit is how they actually heated it. And they talk about, by then, coal was a fairly established means of heating for brick, but to get coal to Dulwich with no railway to take would have been quite difficult. So I wonder whether, in fact, they used the timber and charcoal from the trees and the wood. I suspect by the time they'd finished, Dulwich wood, glamorous as it looks today, looked pretty sorry. As you can see here, brick kilns, they agreed to have them as long as they were no nearer than 200 yards from any trees on college land. And they were signed, not on land. So, yeah, Imthern, while he was there, never moved in. And here's a picture, slightly later picture. There's Sydenham Hill Station, not as we know it now. It had different routes, as you can see. You came in over the top of the tunnel to get in. And there was a ramp up. There's the church, which is from the late 1860s, and there's the manse up here. You can see the land, and here's the tunnel, of course, which was what it was all about. But yeah. So in the Thurn, having leased it to the railway company leased it to Mr. Everett. But Mr. Everett was, although I say solicitor and broker, he was probably a little bit more than that, because he actually was involved with the railway company, placing some of the shares of the London Chatham Railway Company in the stock exchange. The Sharons located some. There was some scandal about it. I think they oversold them. They sold more shares than they actually had. And there's quite a bit of fuss in the Railway News, exciting reading. The railway is built by Peter and Betts, a well-known engineering company who went bust pretty soon after. And Morton Peto is the engineer who did it. The firm, Everett's firm, is Everett and Lucas. And he also placed other shares, and you got him here, there. But these cribs from the archive, Dulwich College archive, show that he's taken over the lease, and it's now he's given the lease till 1895. So presumably that's 84 years. That's roughly, yes, 84 years from 1812. So it's the rest of the lease. And he fenced in the land. He's only paying £184.40. It's got up a bit from previously, but nothing like Vizard paid. But he was Everett was a wheeler dealer. He flipped the site. Once he'd sorted out the leasing arrangements and everything, he sold the property on to Thomas Tapling, pictured here, who was a carpet manufacturer and general, but a fairly major businessman in the City of London. And here's the map of 1876, which shows Kingswood House. It shows the railway line going through the tunnel. Here's the church, there's the thing. And of course, now we have Kingswood Road, or Kingswood Drive as it is now. So what the railway company had to do, because they had to build this part of Kingswood Road, which was then called Church Road, to provide Kingswood with another entrance. And that's the gates you see today. We don't show you a picture because they're looking a little bit sad at the moment. So they built that, and that's the way he would have come in, leaving, of course, the road to Alleyne Park was still there, although the lodge not there. And you can see that development is carrying on around him. So this is Tapling's business, Thomas Tapling Beale and Company, their new warehouse in Gresham Street. So a substantial building. Yeah, quite a business. And here's one of his carpets. This is a wall hanging carpet made by Axminster, and the picture shows Queen Victoria and Emperor Napoleon signing a treaty. Yes, handing over the treaty to Queen Victoria. So he was a player in the carpet business, the wall hanging business. But actually, he seemed to spend most of his time in Brighton. And this is his house in Brighton, number 1 Percival Terrace, Kemp Town. So he obviously fancied Brighton rather than Dulwich. And here is his carpet manufacturer, died in Brighton. He left £120,000. Serious money. And he left it to his sons. Thomas K. Capling, who moved. We're not really sure whether Thomas K. Capling moved into the house or not. But here he is, very smart young man with his moustache. And he also took over the carpet manufacturing business, took over Dad's business. But he was also MP, and more importantly, a stamp collector. In fact, a major stamp collector. Here is his country house, Gumley Hall. This is where he died. He died quite early, leaving a little bit more money, nearly 150,000. So we don't think he lived mainly here, and his constituency was up in Leicestershire as well. But his claim to fame is his stamps. he was one of the first, not professional, but serious stamp collectors. And the value you see here, the value was set at £12,000, but in fact, the British Museum or the British Library thought it was more like £50,000, and equivalent to a huge sum of money today. So the British Library stamp collection is based pretty much on Thomas K. Tapling's own collection. West Norwood Cemetery has their mausoleum, the family's mausoleum. This is the rather nice picture of it. Unfortunately, the reality is not quite so good. When you go there today, that's what you'll see. And work needs to be done, I think. But here we come to possibly the most interesting owner, John Lawson Johnston, inventor of Bovril. Here it is. Whether he actually called it Bovril Castle, not so sure. But anyway, Kingswood House. And here he is. But a really interesting man. So we can talk a little bit first about Bovril. And Bovril, as I've said, comes from the Latin word bos, meaning ox, and vril came from a popular novel at the time called, I've said, The Coming Race, written by Edward Bulwer Lytton. And they had this superior race of humans, the vril ya, whose powers came from electromagnetic substance named vril. And so you get the two together, you get the image of power from the ox, or the bull in the bottle. Now, the interesting thing about Bovril and Johnston is looking at how he invented it, why he invented it, where he came from, and how did it all develop. And there's a lot of stuff online which gives us some idea. But the date, I think the basic story is right, but all the dates don't match up. He was born in 1839. He became a butcher in his uncle's shop, I think, in Edinburgh. And then he is sent to Canada. It's not clear whether he goes to Canada before the 1870s or just after the 1870s. But the story is he goes to Canada, where there are a lot of cows and beef is relatively cheap, to fulfill a contract for the French army. The story is the French army lost to the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 because their victualling system wasn't very good, and they obviously didn't have Bovril. And the feeling was that if they'd have had that, they would have been able to fight back and fight the Germans. But the question is, was it before the Franco-Prussian War or after? I think it's probably after. But that's why I've got this little sign in here under Liebig's extract of meat, because Bovril wasn't the first meat extract paste, if you like. Liebig's was invented in the 1840s, and it's sort of similar. It was invented by a German chemist, but it was launched on the London Stock Exchange in 1865 for putting a value of £150,000 on it. And it is likely, although I can't prove it, but there's sort of evidence that Lawson Johnston knew about this, and he had discussions in Edinburgh with the Liebig's chemists about putting it together. And I think the other thing to think about the French needing something different, because of course Liebig's was German, so presumably the French felt that they couldn't really take the Germans' meat extract. Anyway, Johnston goes over to Canada, apparently, and sets up and manufactures Bovril in Canada and to fulfill this French thing. And his business goes quite well until the early 1880s, when his factory burns down and he decides to return to England. Now, we haven't had time to check the Atlantic records, the Atlantic crossing records on the ships as to exactly when he did it. And if you look at the Wikipedia and everything, they say, oh, he returned to England and he lived at Kingswood. Not so. He must have returned to England in the mid-1880s. And I think he lived up in North London, where he built his first factory. And here is his first or second factory, in the Bovril factory in Old Street. And here's his architect, Henry Vaughan Lanchester, who built that, although somewhat older than when Johnston would have known him, and also built Kingswood House, or rebuilt Kingswood House, or extended Kingswood House. He was very young when he met, he was not even 30 when he built Kingswood. So he must have been quite how Lanchester and Johnston met, I don't know. There's nothing to say, but Lanchester later went on to become quite well known as an architect, and he was RRBA gold medalist in 1934. But he was a young man, under 30, when he built Kingswood House. But as I say, he also built Kingswood Factory at the same time. So Johnston must have seen something there. And here's a picture of in the grounds of the staff and family. Yeah. And here he is in his study. But the interesting thing about Bovril, we think today that, some of our businessmen are, let's put it politely, entrepreneurial, or sail a little close to the wind. John Lawson Johnson was no different, and they were no different in Victorian times. And as we'll come on to later, neither were the Vesties, who lived in the house later. Johnston sold up Bovril in 1896, or sold his shares for £2 million, a credible sum of money in those days. He retained chairmanship of the board, but he sold it to somebody like Everett, who was a promoter of companies on the stock exchange, and it was put on the stock exchange for £2.5 million. But the running of it didn't go well. Bovril struggled a bit, and in fact, Johnson, in the end, at one point, had to put money into it to keep it afloat. But he still kept his £2 million, and he went off to do other things. And this was one of the things he did. He bought himself a yacht, as you do. It's a 200-foot yacht, which by the standards of the day is quite substantial, perhaps not so much now. And it was originally owned by Lily Langtry, the mistress of the Prince of Wales. So it was quite something. Lawson acquired it quite cheaply because he bought it off an American. He called it the White Lady, and he used to sail around in it. And of course, it was unfortunate that he'd gone down to Cannes in 1900 when he died on the boat. Just prior to that, he had become the tenant in Inverary Castle in his Scottish roots. So I think while he was certainly in Kingswood in the early 1890s, by the time mid-1890s, he wasn't spending much time there, and he was in his castle on his boat. And here's his semi-obituary in the Westminster Gazette, which this bit says he's a really fantastic guy, a man to be loved and remembered, founder of a great business, but as one of nature's true noblemen, worthy and lovable every department of life, spotlessly honest in business, model husband and father, etc., etc. And then read this bit. It says that the Chancellor of the Exchequer will be disappointed in the product of Mr. Johnson's estate, as a large proportion of his capital was invested in Argentina, and moreover, he gave substantial sums to his children during his lifetime. So he sorted out his money. He'd already got rid of it. But here's a description of the house for sale, and it has by this time, it's got 27 bed and dressing rooms, 5 bathrooms, a stately hall, a suite of entertainment rooms, billiard room as before, smoking rooms, and up to 9 horses from 4. So it's probably doubled or trebled the size. And as it says here, the whole property, upon which much money has been most lavishly expended, yes, to a businessman or member of Parliament desirous presiding amidst lovely rural surroundings within a 6-mile drive of the city. And here is his grave at West Norwood Cemetery. And here it is. his wife. So he dies in 1900. His wife stays on in the house for a little while. But they can't sell it, but they get a tenant, a sublessee, with a chap called Serge de Bolotov. This is a picture of him in the 20s. As we say, I've said prince. He was a Russian, well, he said he was a Russian prince, inventor, as we'll see. And again, a bit of a wide boy, probably. But he did quite well for himself. This is his mother on her wedding, Princess Maria Vazemsky from Russia, who provided the funding for his various activities. But here he is living in the house in 1911. He's only 23, as you say, living on private means with mother, sister, brothers, visitors, and 7 servants. So they weren't struggling. And here are the others. Kingswood Lodge, you've got the gardener, domestic gardener, and you've got the stables with the butler and the gardener. But he married later in life, later in 1918, he married Rosalie Selfridge, son of Gordon Selfridge of the department store. And really, that sort of set him up quite well. But what he did do, he was apparently interested in aeroplanes. Again, the online gives us some possibilities. He was originally thinking of doing something for the Daily Mail, France to England crossing of the Channel, which was done by Louis Blériot in 1909, but I don't think he ever got around to it. They talk about a triplane, they talk about some basic things, and these are sort of later in life. He also invented clutch and gear levers, probably a bit late. And he was Robert Mond, who's ICI. So he sort of dabbled. He obviously had private funds and he dabbled, and he may also have dabbled in this, but he didn't pay his bills. And finally, he was kicked out by this gentleman here, William Dederick, merchant and businessman, who's a very interesting character. Here he is again. But he's a German, originally Wilhelm Dederick or Willy Dederick. In 1901, he's living in Peckham Rye, and his career as a brush salesman. So you think on the face of it, that's not much of a business, but within 10 years, he's a serious player. In 1911, he's living at the De Kaiser's Hotel in Victoria Embankment. But this is the sort of house he would have been. It's not the exact, because the houses that he would have lived in have been knocked down, but they were similar to these. So, but even by Dulwich standard, that's a reasonable sized house. So brush salesman, I think we could say prosperous brush salesman. When you look at the records, it says he's a railway contractor. It calls him a railway contractor. He's not really a railway. He's a manufacturer. He dabbled. He had various companies, and one of his was the inventions, or the companies he owned, made the D-bag feed water heater for steam locomotives. I have no idea what it would have done, but it was all about fuel economy, even those days. But this is him in 1921. He didn't last at Kingswood very long. As we'll see, just coming on to the Canadians later, he moved in 1912 and left by 15, 16, he'd gone. And this was his house he'd gone to. He went to Weybridge. And that's his lease assignment in 1912. 2 weeks later, they got plans for alterations. They're making various minor details, 150 quid, not much. And then he started entertaining worthies. So he must have been, they must have overlooked that he was a German, or he must have spoken English very well. But here we are after the start of, after the start of the First World War, he was holding events with the mayor of Camberwell. And even then, he was giving £50 for for the Red Cross, and offered part of his house for the Red Cross. So seems that within a couple of years, he had enough or didn't like it. But the most one of the things that he was, and if you've been looking at women's suffrage, there was a party or an event in Kingswood Grounds in 1913 where Lloyd George spoke about Thomas Luff, who was had nothing to do with Dulwich. But there was a riot, basically. The suffragettes really got upset about it, frequently up to, I think it was a bit more than that. The stories we found subsequently is, they were really rough on the women, and it was some really nasty going, because the men just chucked them straight out. Anyway, so he was obviously well connected with Lloyd George, although funnily enough, unlike Mr. Vestes will come along later, he didn't receive a knighthood or anything, or perhaps he didn't put up enough money. Anyway, there he goes. So even though he starts as a German, he's very well connected. And here is a picture of him. And we have another incident, and there's Sir Ernest Shackleton. And here he is again. Shackleton, in all these pictures, looks very, very uncomfortable. Here's Dederick here. And we know that he was part of, it says it here, the organizing the stores for Shackleton's 1914 expedition to Antarctica, which of course led to his great thing on the James Caird, and his 18 days to save the ship. But there we go. So he was well connected here. And the interesting thing, I put in Bovril here because we know that Ernest Shackleton took Bovril with him to the Antarctica, and that was one of the things that kept them alive in the James Caird on the boat, was the quantity of Bovril they had with them. But here we come across Massey Harris Convalescent Home. And these pictures are courtesy of the Canada Research Knowledge Network, Canadiana, which we've discovered only relatively recently, but a fantastic resource of the short period the Canadians were in the house. And this is one of their bulletins. And they took it over early in, there's the house, there's a bit of, so in February 1916, the license goes to Messrs. Mary Harris. Dederick moves away. And here we are. And this, we think of Kingswood House as the only Canadian convalescent home, but here's another one, the Bromley Court Hotel, still standing. And they also had a hospital in Orpington. So there was quite a big operation. Had 105 beds at Kingswood. And this gives you some, and these magazines we've been able to find describes life there, about, how they built up the patients, with massages and recreation, tea parties for local residents, excursions to London. They used the billiard room. They were out and about. It was, a great place to recoup. And here is a picture of some of the local ladies at the formal opening of the home who were involved. And here's some pictures of the Kingswood, the staff, July the 6th, 1917. The matron in her outdoor uniform, that looks a bit serious. The nurses at the shooting Empire Day, the hat trimming competition. That sounds a fun event. And the bun eating competition, no less. But no, this is a fantastic resource that we've discovered about this short period when the house was owned by the Canadians. It was visited by the Duke and Duchess of Connaught, and of course the King and the Queen. Queen Mary, well known to us in Dulwich, for her visits to Dulwich Park. Not so much King George. And here's a picture of the patients and sisters outside the building, about 1917. But the war's finished in 1918 and the Canadians move out, and Dederick assigns the lease to Vesti, Baron Vesti. Now, Vesti had been living in Bessemer House at this time. This was his previous house, Quarry Bank House in Maghull in the north. But in 1909, he moved to Bessemer House. And in 1913, he was made a baronet of Bessemer House. And then, as many people know, in 1922, he purchased for £25,000 the Baron Vestey of Kingswood off Lloyd George. And the story is that George V was extremely reluctant to sign it off because he said Vestey, as we'll come on to in a minute, was a tax avoider, which he was, no doubt about it. But the interesting thing is the reason the Vesteys moved from Bessemer to Kingswood is that Mrs. Vestey, Lady Vestey, was involved with Kingswood while the Canadians were there. And I think she thought, well, Bessemer House is a substantial property, but Kingswood was rather better, or perhaps better grounds. So she persuaded her husband to move, even though she didn't live there long, to move in. And this is him and his family. And the Vesteys, by the standards of the time, were an incredibly large business. This is him here. I think this is the second Mrs. Vestey, which we'll come on to in a minute. And here is the second Mrs. Vestey, Evelyn Broadstone. Now, if you think of women and glass ceilings, Evelyn Broadstone, she started as a stenographer at Vestey's in Chicago. And by the time she married him, she was their chief accountant and really managed the whole business. And she was reputed to earn $250,000 a year in 1919. Now, that seems just incredible. But the interesting thing, she was an American, and she's buried here in the town of Superior. She came from Nebraska, Superior, Nebraska. And even today, each year, there is the Lady Vestey Festival in her honor. And here it is. And I did check online recently. Yep, 2024, there will be a Lady Vestey Festival in Superior, Nebraska. And then the Vestey was also, he owned the Blue Star Line to bring his refrigerated meat from America, originally designed to bring eggs from China. You find that a bit difficult to think of now, but yeah, the eggs, apparently in the early Edwardian periods, keeping fresh eggs was a problem, and he managed to acquire them from China and use his refrigerated ships. So there was a huge shipping line. There was the Union Cold Storage Company, and of course he owned Dewhurst Butchers, as many of you all know. So a huge company, and he was there until 1946. And here is a letter. He died in 1940, and his son wrote a letter to the Dulwich estate in 1940. I think it's 1946. I can't quite see, 1945, about thoughts what he had for the building with Kingswood House. And you've got the Union Cold Store. And he tells what they used it for: staff hotel and recreation centre. And some of the staff were living there. And they were thinking about, they expected to bring the facilities of joint, to beef it up. 2 weeks later, there's a note in the Dulwich Estate Minutes saying, we've heard a rumour that the London County Council are going to purchase Kingswood House, compulsory purchase house, and redevelop it as a housing estate. And here you've got a later in 1946, shocked by the, isn't this Dulwich? Shocked by the news that flats may be built in West Dulwich. There were NIMBYs even then, I suspect. And here's Lord Vestey, the Meat King, protest petition. Anyway, there we go. So we've come to the end of, well, we haven't come to the end of the line, but we've come to the end of this talk, and we'll just finish off with it today, which I took a screen grab from a Kingswood Arts email, e-newsletter they sent out today, showing it in its current form with a party in the grounds. So it's good, and it's great that Kingswood Arts have taken it over and have really developed its sort of social and community side, because the council never really did that. And we've got this fantastic resource. On reflection, it might have been better placed in Dulwich, or they could have, it's hidden away. A lot of people don't know it's there. But it's great that it's being properly used and being really worked on. So there we go.